Hello, I'm Seth. This is Acquired Salary. In today's video, I'm going to react to CNBC's piece on why the American dream has become unaffordable for the middle class. If you're new here, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. I'd greatly appreciate if you drop a like on the video and subscribe to this channel. It's support like this that helps to grow Acquired Salary's reach, which allows me to continue providing you with free tools, information, and perspectives you need to build the life you want. With that, let's get into it.
At the national level, the middle class is typically defined as households with an annual income ranging between $53,740 and $161,220. But middle class Americans like Kyle Connolly from Pensacola, Florida, says life has quickly grown unaffordable.
Financially, things have definitely been a struggle for me. I don't know how, but every single month I somehow managed to get by. And I'm left with, maybe this past month, I was left with $125 in my checking account, and that's it.
As of June 2024, 65% of middle class Americans said they were struggling financially and don't expect their situation to improve for the rest of their lives.
It's a part.
That there is depressing, but from that standpoint, making $50,000 to $160,000, that's a pretty wide range of income. It's $110,000 range, but from that standpoint, you look at the median earnings for the United States, and it's something like $60,000 to $70,000. So it kind of checks out. Like if you're making the median, you're in the middle class, and it's kind of crazy that who knows what this lady's salary was, but overall, being left with $125 in your checking account leaves virtually no room for savings, which, when it comes to living the American dream, per the Investopedia article, you need to be saving and investing because your lifetime earnings is probably not going to suffice to obtain the American dream. So it's crazy, and we'll see what else they have to say in terms of why things are the way they are.
Of the income distribution that has felt a lot of pain in the wake of the pandemic. And it wasn't something that just economists were tracking. It was something that was really felt on the household level. You know, people felt it in their grocery bills. People felt it at the gas pump.
In their own neighborhoods and in their own lives, they have their own expectations for what they can do, where they can go, where they can eat, where they can live. And to the degree that they're facing those pressures on an individual basis, it really is causing quite a bit of an alarm.
75% of middle-income families say they are actively cutting back on non-essential expenses, with 73% finding it difficult to save for the future.
I have had.
Yeah, to that point, the average American can't afford an unexpected expense of $1,000, which speaks to not having any savings whatsoever. And from that standpoint, it's dangerous in terms of the overall economy if 75% of Americans are cutting back on spending, because the consumer makes up a significant portion of gross GDP. So gross domestic product, gross, yeah. Well, you get my point. From that standpoint, if Americans are cutting back on spending, then our GDP growth is going to be lower, which kind of can potentially lead us into a recession, which is something that the economy is seemingly flirting with at this point in time.
Had to reduce all non-essential spending. I have gotten one haircut because it just got out of control, and that's it. That's all that I can afford.
We can do so much better. To all of you watching, we can get back to an America that's affordable again.
There's a strong role for policy in affecting the prices of all of these essential goods, from housing to childcare to healthcare expenses.
I think there's a lot of scope to have government programs.
From that standpoint, I'm sure there are policies that can directly impact the cost of housing, but overall, it's going to have to be policy that incentivizes builders to build smaller homes, because currently builders make the most money when they build a bigger home, and we have an affordability crisis where the younger generations, they want to buy their starter home, but there's virtually no starter homes out there just because it's so expensive in general, because there's a supply and demand issue. So from that standpoint, there are certainly policies that could be implemented, but we have to make sure those policies incentivize builders to build homes that are affordable for the younger generations that aren't making as much money, or even just in general the middle class.
Programs that help the middle class quite a bit more.
So how has the middle class life become so unaffordable for Americans?
Housing is always going to be typically the biggest bite of a household's budget. I think that's probably a primary issue in terms of why people are feeling that crunch.
I am currently renting, and I would say that the housing is probably about 65% of my monthly expenses, where it should be the other way around. It should be 33%.
The median rent for middle income families has risen by 18% to $1,300 per household between 2001 and 2022.
You've just seen this
If you just do the math on that, like that's over a $13,000 annual increase. It's whatever, it's just shy of $16,000 a year. And that's an increase. While perhaps the quality of your residence has probably not increased to that degree. It's pretty crazy that rent is increasing so fast, but again, it boils down to supply and demand. You can see, I mean, real estate in general is very localized. So there's some local markets where rent is decreasing, but that's because there's a large influx of supply. So again, I personally think the solution to the housing stuff is going to be implementing policies that encourage builders or encourage investors to create more housing supply.
hence upward pressure on the cost of rent, and that filters through to the cost of buying a house.
Existing home prices hit a record in June 2024, with existing homes selling at a median price of $426,900. According to the most recent analysis, US is facing a shortage of 4.5 million homes. In 2022, families in the US increased by 1.8 million, but only 1.4 million housing units were built to meet the demand.
We've got lots of families who are trying to form, people leave college, they leave their parents' house, they want to buy their own house, and we just haven't seen housing construction.
If you don't build more housing, then housing becomes more expensive. And that's exactly what's happening in a lot of coastal cities and increasingly more and more cities across the United States, so that it becomes very unaffordable to buy a house.
What it amounts to.
From that standpoint, yeah, you need to increase the supply, but if you're living in a big city, you are limited by the land. So you can only add so many units in a specific area of land, and zoning laws play a part in this. But you often run into people don't want apartment complexes put up next to their single family home or their suburb home, and so obviously you can address some of the policies there by changing zoning laws and just essentially telling people to get over it. But from that standpoint, you still can only build so many properties and have only so many units available. And that's where we're starting to sprawl out of the big cities and create suburbs that are even farther from people's place of work, which is why remote work is so popular, because the only home you can afford is an hour and a half away from where you work. But that's where we kind of see that pushback against the people that have been working remote not wanting to go back into the office because they can only afford to live elsewhere. That's super far, and the length of your commute is typically not compensated, and it just makes your work satisfaction decrease significantly. So it is rather crazy how impactful housing is in terms of overall life satisfaction.
To our state and local policies that have really operated over the course of several decades to restrict housing supply.
It's the old story that people in single family homes in desirable neighborhoods really push back against efforts to build more housing in those neighborhoods. They complain about the parking. They complain about pressure on infrastructure.
Experts say policy intervention is essential to tackling the affordability crisis.
There's an opportunity today to rethink how the federal government interacts with housing markets. We already see this in markets like healthcare in the United States. It's not a purely privatized market. There is a government role, both in terms of investments and also just in terms of thinking about how we organize policies.
We don't need to build public housing in the suburbs, but we do need to build more densely near the city center, allow for duplexes and triplexes, at least some amount of light touch density that allows more people to live near where their jobs are, and it brings down rents and home prices a bit, even if that's going to not be as good for existing homeowners.
From that standpoint, because the mass shortage at this point in time, I don't think there's going to be a significant decrease in rent or housing prices. Rather, it would just slow the rate at which those prices are going up, unless we have a really dramatic increase in the amount of supply. But that's not going to happen for a few years at least.
Add to that we see childcare costs that have also exploded over the years. In some parts of the country, you have households paying upwards of $25,000 per year.
The cost of childcare has risen at more than twice the rate of inflation in the US, increasing by 273% between 1990 and 2024.
We expect these families.
With that increase, it kind of explains why the younger generations aren't having any kids, and we're below replacement rate in terms of the birth rate at this point in time, because it's too cost prohibitive. And there's people out there that are complaining, well, we need to change this, we need to change this. Well, we need to address the cost of childcare and housing, because if you're not in a house and you don't own, you're not going to be building wealth as fast, even if you're investing in the stock market, because the leverage that is involved in housing, as well as reducing the rate at which the cost of childcare is increasing, is going to be very beneficial to encouraging people, incentivizing people to be like, hey, you're now more capable of raising kids. So that's one way to address it, but there's obviously other ways that we can address it. But still, childcare that's crazy. I didn't even know that, and that's insane. No wonder people aren't having kids.
Families to go and participate in the labor market, but they need this vital support.
We have a system in the US that is just so much you're on your own, unless you're very, very poor and can get a subsidy.
I'm very fortunate that what I do to earn an income does not require me to have childcare. I would basically be making the equivalent of $7.50 an hour over the summer if I had to pay for full-time childcare for 3 children. It doesn't make sense.
In 2023, 67% of parents reported spending at least 20% of their annual income on childcare, while 89% said they spent 10% or more of their household income on childcare.
We see here is really a marketplace that's still in a bit of disarray. We have shortages in childcare centers. We have childcare workers who really report being underpaid, which then exacerbates the problem.
You sometimes have states or localities insisting on regulations that just don't make sense for childcare, that make onerous restrictions on child to staff ratios or certain zoning restrictions on where you can have a childcare facility.
And so again, here, there is an opportunity to prop up this labor market and this overall marketplace. We saw some of this effort taking place during the pandemic. In 2021, the United States embarked upon a historic expansion in the refundable child tax credit.
Expanded not just in its generosity, but also in the number of families it reached. It went deep into the middle class. Like often the child tax credit in previous years has just really been a low income program. This one really spread out, didn't start phasing out until $100,000 or more for a bunch of families.
That was a 1-year experiment that expired. You've had policymakers advocating for making this 2021 expanded child tax credit permanent, but it has faced resistance in the Congress.
So when it comes to that, my question would be, what's the cause for this resistance, and what is the data showing in terms of how did that tax credit affect the overall economy, and how well people were doing in terms of being able to provide childcare, as well as was there any perhaps impact on the birth rate? Obviously it's indirect, because there's many other factors that contribute to the birth rate, but from that standpoint, if that's got any sort of indication that it has had an effect, it might be a lever worth pulling.
Healthcare is another major factor making the middle-class lifestyle unaffordable for many American families. In 2021, about 12.4 million middle-class families had unpaid medical bills, the highest among all other income groups.
Healthcare expenses weigh heavily on me because I don't have health insurance personally. My children do, but I don't. Every time I sit down to go ahead and look for a health plan that would make sense, I get discouraged because what I can afford has like a $15,000 deductible, but I'm giving them $600 a month.
It's pretty well known by now that if you compare the US to almost any other advanced country, we spend a ton more on healthcare and we do not get better health outcomes.
The US
Part of the reason that the US spends so much more on healthcare is because we are pretty much the primary innovators in the healthcare space. But at that same time, healthcare specifically impacts the middle class the most, because if you're in the lower class, it's pretty much they don't have any wealth or money to pay back. So those medical bills can just end up being declared bankruptcy. Well, the lower class can declare bankruptcy and get rid of that debt, as the upper class can actually afford their health care as they need. It's really that middle class target where it's like, okay, you have some money, but you don't seem to have enough for the best healthcare that you would ideally like, which makes it really difficult, and very significant portion of the population, the middle class, is going to be, very concerned about healthcare.
spends about $12,742 per person on healthcare, the highest cost per capita compared to other wealthy OECD countries. However, the country still ranks lower on key health measures like life expectancy and infant mortality when compared to similar nations.
Everything costs more. Doctors cost more, drugs cost more, devices cost more. And that to me just seems to be a clear problem of market power in the healthcare sector. And so you've got
I don't know the specific percentage of the population that works in healthcare, but a vast majority of Americans, not a vast majority, a significant portion of the population works in healthcare. So overall, it does kind of make sense that it is so expensive, because so many people work in healthcare and make their living in healthcare, and you can make a really good living in healthcare in the right situation. So that is going to be a contributing factor, like the distribution of who works where, and having such a significant population working in healthcare and needing to provide good salaries to actually ensure that you have the proper staff is kind of it's a little bit of a runaway to where, okay, well, we need to provide a good wage so that we can, ensure that we have employees to provide healthcare. But when you provide that good wage, you have to be able to pay those wages, which is going to increase the healthcare costs.
got pharmaceutical companies that unambiguously have market power. That's what patents are. And unlike other countries that really try to leverage some kind of monopsony power against pharmaceutical companies to sort of countervail their monopoly power, we don't do that much in the US. Besides drugs, you've got growing consolidation in sort of hospitals and specialty providers.
A study by Harvard University discovered that hospital prices in markets with a monopoly are 15% higher in areas with 4 or more hospitals. And research from UCLA revealed that monopoly protection increased consumer costs by $52.6 billion across a sample of 355 brand name drugs.
Do we really need to debate why monopolies are bad? Like, obviously, monopolies are bad, and this is just an example of why they are so bad, because it can screw over the end consumer, and when it's something so important such as healthcare, that's not something that we want to incentivize, but we seem to be incentivizing.
In response to these concerns, the Justice Department launched a task force in May 2024, focused on specifically addressing monopolies and collusion in the healthcare sector.
You want to leverage the power of public buyers of healthcare, to bargain with them and countervail. But then you also want to do antitrust, to say, if you're going to buy up every anesthesiologist in a given area and start price gouging, we're not going to let you do that. We're actually going to regulate, or we're going to disallow the mergers.
Prices are also rising for essential expenses other than the big three.
The utilities that are just slowly increasing. It's like every month, it's like my usage is down, but why is my bill higher? Obviously, groceries are more expensive. It hurts. It really does hurt when I have to tell my children no. When I have to tell them that, sorry, we can't go to this activity because I don't have the extra $120 to spare this month. As a mother, that's kind of like the hardest part.
Rising prices have been a major talking point for the 2024 election.
For Harris and Trump, focusing on the middle class, speaking directly to promises of building the middle class or rescuing the middle class, these are promises that in some way offer an umbrella pitch for why they are the best candidate for the health of the US economy.
I was raised as a middle class kid. And I am actually the only person on this stage who has a plan that is about lifting up the middle class and working people of America.
She wants to build 3 million new homes over the courses of her potential administration, increase the supply of housing, and lower the price. She has pledged to crack down on hidden junk fees and other corporate pricing practices that she sees as the reason for high prices. For Harris, a lot of boosting the middle class comes down to putting more money in the middle class's wallet.
I have a plan, $6,000 for young families for the first year of your child's life, $25,000 down payment assistance for first-time home buyers.
For Trump, he's painting his candidacy as sort of the change campaign. People are sick of the economic status quo, and he wants to be the person to relieve them of the economic pain that he sees as the result of a disastrous Biden-Harris administration.
I had no inflation, virtually no inflation. They had the highest inflation perhaps in the history of our country.
For him, lowering prices and ending inflation is a matter of growing the economy as a whole. A lot of his proposals, economists have analyzed and said they could threaten to reheat inflation in the short term. Things like his tariff proposals that would increase producer costs for manufacturers, which could then translate to higher consumer prices.
We're doing tariffs on other countries. Other countries are going to finally, after 75 years, pay us back for all that we've done for the world.
He says,
in the immediate term, tariffs are definitely inflationary. However, there are downstream consequences of every single policy, and that's one of the things that we have to consider when we're talking about policies. What are the trade-offs in the immediate term and in the long term? And when it comes down to it, there is a lot of nuance and finer details that we have to discuss and think about in terms of, okay, obviously on Trump's side of things, he wants to do tariffs to bring manufacturing back to the United States, which is going to provide more jobs for Americans. And Kamala Harris wants to build new homes, but then she also wants to add a $25,000 first-time homebuyer down payment assistance. Well, if you think about the downstream consequences, you are not going to find one perfect policy. There's always going to be trade-offs when it comes to making policy decisions. So it's a question of what's our long-term goal and what's the most effective way of achieving that long-term goal. And I'm not really going to discuss any more of the details around these political policy proposals, but from that standpoint, that it's all about the policies and the downstream consequences.
Look at the long term. Once we grow the economy in the long term, that value is going to trickle down and outweigh any short-term costs or pain that you feel from the immediate implementation of some of his plans.
The middle class is really a component of the American experience that many people aspire to. It really does connote a feeling of opportunity, not just for that family, but for their children's and really future generations. I think government policy is really central to thinking about the challenges facing the middle class today. And it would be beneficial if more Americans had a feel for how these policies interact with and really affect the well-being of their families.
When it comes down to it, I'm surprised that they also didn't touch on the cost of college, because that's one of the, I feel like, well, I think overall when you're in high school, so many people push you into going to college so that you can get your key to unlock the door into the middle class lifestyle. But at the same time, the cost of college has been expanding exponentially, and it's kind of out of control, contributing to the unaffordability of the American dream, because it's so cost prohibitive to get a college degree. So then you come out and you have debt, and then this debt is, for some people, it's like almost the equivalent of a car payment or even a small mortgage on, the cheap home in the middle of nowhere. So from that standpoint, there's all kinds of factors that contribute to the growing expense and unaffordability of the American dream. But I'm curious to see, what do you think? Are there any policies kind of discussed in this video that you think would be great and we need to implement? Or I think really the most important part is they're talking more so on the federal level, like what policies can be implemented. I think it's more so in the local and municipal government side of things where you're going to see the most impact when policies get implemented. Like if you're changing zoning laws of your specific municipality, that's going to change where builders can go and add more housing to therefore decrease the cost of housing and decrease the rents. But again, it's all about trade-offs and what are the downstream consequences. So please share your thoughts and comments in the comment section below. Until next time.